Thanks for coming, and whenever I give a talk like this, I like to get a read of the audience to start with so I know where to start. Any fellow anarchists among us? Okay, all right, good. Anybody ever read Kropotkin? Emma Goldman? Okay, all right, good. Okay, well, let me get started, and I'll start with a question that has an obvious answer given the topic of tonight. What does Tolstoy, Camille Pissarro, John Cage, the musician, Pissarro the painter, Tolstoy the novelist, and Bertrand Russell the philosopher, what do they have in common? They're all anarchists. And Tolstoy is an interesting exception because he's the one motto you might have heard of anarchists is no gods, no masters. Well, Tolstoy is the one exception to the anarchist rule of atheism, and there's a whole school of anarchism that's based upon early Christian brotherhood that Tolstoy developed. But let me start at the beginning. Anarchism is really the flower that blooms starting with the process of individuation in the Renaissance. The Reformation inflames this process, and in 1792, there is a book published that basically begins the anarchist tradition, and it's Political Justice by William Godwin. Now, Godwin is a name that many of you are probably not familiar with, but if you lived in the late 18th century, you would have known him well. He and Edmund Burke were the two leading intellectuals in England at the time, and Burke was an opponent of the French Revolution, and Godwin was a defender of the French Revolution. When the French Revolution went south, Godwin's star sank, to the point that the poet Shelley was surprised to learn that Godwin was still alive in 1813. And Shelley knocks on his door and basically says, I have been inspired by you all my life. I want to, get to know you better. Well, the end result is that Shelley ran off with Godwin's daughter, Mary. Mary Shelley is the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, the first feminist, and William Godwin, the first anarchist. Where did Godwin get his ideas? Well, he was trained as a dissenting minister, and if you know your religious history, in England there was a tradition that after the Toleration Acts were passed that allowed, basically if you were going to teach, if you were going to get a job and so forth, you had to be a member of the Church of England. But they allowed dissenters, people who had a different point of view, to develop their own institutions, and they came to rival, in fact, the great academic institutions that the Church of England, of course, were very influential in sponsoring and directing. Well, what Godwin does is this dissenting tradition. The fundamental principle of the dissenting tradition was the right of private judgment. That no one can interfere with your relationship to God. That is your relationship, it's your responsibility, and you come to God in your own way. So this is the fundamental difference between the dissenters and the Church of England. The Church of England, of course, had priests and bishops, and for example, one of the big controversies that led to the American Revolution in the 1870s was about whether or not to have an American bishop in the United States. And of course, this is another authority, and the locals didn't want to have rivals and so forth. But the fundamental difference here is: are you going to rely on authorities to tell you what to think and do, or are you going to depend upon your own private judgment? Well, anarchists all say it's up to you to make up your own mind, and that coercion of any sort is immoral. It's a form of robbery. If I force you to do something, I have stolen basically your humanity. If you think about some of the classic definitions of revolution, Marx basically said that the revolution can be defined by making the subject the predicate and the predicate the subject. In other words, you take people who are acted upon and make them the actors, and vice versa. Lenin said, asked to define revolution, he simply said, whom? Who acts? Who is acted upon? Okay? And the idea is that the only way that you can have a moral system, and that's what political justice, Godwin's book, is all about. The only way you can have a moral political system is without the state. That whenever a process of authority enters into a relationship, one person becomes the object and one person becomes the actor. So the idea for Godwin and for anarchists is that you retain the right of private judgment in all matters. Okay. So in the beginning, anarchism was largely a philosophical doctrine, and if you read Political Justice, it's a very long, very intricate book, but it remains the best articulation of why the state is unjust. So that's one pillar of anarchism: opposition to the state. All anarchists are opposed to the state. That doesn't mean we're opposed to government. There is a fundamental distinction between the state and government. The state is the permanent institutions, in particular the coercive institutions, the police, the jails, the legislatures, the presidents, and so forth. Those institutions, that's the state. Governing is how we decide among ourselves, and among anarchists, of course, face-to-face consensual decision-making along the lines of, say, a Quaker meeting. That is the model of decision-making and the model of governance among anarchists. So the right of private judgment, opposition to the state, gets joined in the 1830s and 40s with opposition to capitalism, and it's Proudhon who is the first to call himself an anarchist and who argues that property is theft in his famous book, What is Property?, published in 1840. Proudhon is a very interesting character. He was a peasant. He herded sheep and so forth as a child, but he was a genius, recognized very early on by the local authorities that he was a child of some exception, really an exceptional child, and he got a scholarship to the local school, for which he was continually punished for not bringing his books, which he always forgot. Of course, he couldn't afford the books. Anyway, his family has a bit of an economic problem, and he is forced to leave school, and he apprentices himself to a printer, and in essence, that became his college. By setting type, he learned, he taught himself Latin so that he could become a compositor in Latin, but in the process of setting type, he learned the basic classics, the important works. And I got the idea back in 1996 when we were in Japan, teaching at the beginning of the internet, that I could teach students about anarchism by having them mark up anarchist texts. And the product is Anarchy Archives, and if you go to anarchyarchives.org, that's my website that my students and I have created over the last 20 years, and that in essence is the collected works of the anarchists. So if you want to read any anarchists, go to Anarchy Archives and you'll find the classic anarchists. Now, Proudhon was a very important character. He established a number of basic principles of anarchism, including one of the most important, which is how do we organize ourselves in a large mass society. And for Proudhon, the method was federation. That is, much like we are a federal system, he argued that communities could organize themselves, small communities here, ally with another community, and then you form maybe a larger alliance, maybe county-wide, and you could create any number of intervening organizations of different sizes, but the arrow of authority, unlike our society, in which the arrow of authority points from the top down, telling everybody else what to do, in an anarchist federation, the arrow of authority points from the bottom up. And you have people who kind of represent the community, but they're not representatives. The fundamental difference between a representative and a delegate is a representative decides for you. A delegate brings the issue back to you and lets you decide. So that's how anarchist federations have always worked. You've had a local community, maybe in Geneva or London or wherever, and they would have elect a delegate, and that delegate would go to the annual meetings and come back with resolutions, and those resolutions were never binding on the organization until the lowest level has agreed to whatever propositions were being presented. So, opposition to the state, bottom-up organization, federation, components. But for Proudhon, and why he's important, is he basically develops the idea of surplus value, which, if you know your Marx, that's one of the fundamental one of the fundamental ideas in Marx, which he takes from Proudhon. In fact, Marx idolized Proudhon as a young man. In the 1840s, he and Bakunin and Harrison and a wide number of intellectuals come to Paris and sit at Proudhon's feet. And this is where Marx learns much of his economics. In fact, anything that is useful in Marx came from Proudhon. All the crap came from Hegel. Now, the idea of surplus value is that the full value is never paid to the worker. In other words, we all get together and we work and we create a nice place, but if we don't own this place and then it gets sold off, the profits are going to go to somebody else, not to the people who built it. Okay? So surplus value is that portion of what workers produce that is not returned to the people who create the value, but is returned to the owner, the capitalist. And Proudhon argued that this was a form of theft, and that's why the famous phrase, property is theft, that naturally created a bit of a stir. The people that sponsored him for his scholarship decided that they had made a mistake. Bakunin, the guy that I mentioned, who was in Paris in the 40s with Marx and Proudhon, Bakunin is the next important anarchist, okay, after Proudhon. And he and Marx get into a monumental battle. And it comes back in a way to the relationship to Proudhon. Bakunin pretty much bought Proudhon's economic system. Michael Bakunin's a Russian. He is basically the founder of the collectivist anarchist school of thought. Proudhon is a mutualist. And in fact, in the United States, for example, people will call themselves mutualists. In France, they call them mutualists. And that was the term. Not until the 1870s are people calling themselves anarchists. But the ideas and the principles and everything are all there. And as I said, Proudhon calls himself an anarchist, but it's not a movement yet. It doesn't become a movement until the First International, which brings Marx and Bakunin together again. Now, Marx had wanted to collaborate with Proudhon and asked him, let's work together and develop a full critique of capitalism. Proudhon understood that Marx was an authoritarian, and he puts him down in rather strong terms, creating a lifelong enemy. So Proudhon writes the philosophy of poverty. Marx writes his worst book in response. the poverty of philosophy. And most people who know Proudhon, they get their Proudhon from having read Marx's The Poverty of Philosophy, and they get a very, very distorted view of what Proudhon had to say. I'm going to skip quite a bit here, and well, now actually, before I get into the politics of the International, let me talk a little bit more about the early period, because it would tie in more with you know, the Good Life Center, and that is in the first 50 years after the publication of Political Justice, anarchism was primarily small, a few people here, a few people there. You know, not a mass movement. We're not talking about millions of people. That comes. The First International has 5 million members at its height. We're talking, you know, it becomes a mass movement by the end of the 19th century. But the first half of the 19th century, anarchism is primarily experimental. So, for example, Proudhon created an experiment with the People's Bank. And the idea for Proudhon was that since the only thing that creates value is labor, money should be based on labor. And he created labor notes. So if it took you 3 hours to grow some corn, you take your corn in to the time store, if you will. I'm mixing up a couple stories here, but I'll explain it. You bring it into the store and you say, this cost me it took 3 hours to produce this. You get a labor note, and I could show you pictures online of these labor notes. And that allows you to buy products that took someone else 3 hours to build, to maybe make a coat or shoes or something like that. So you exchanged labor for labor. And the People's Bank was Proudhon's system for doing this. He actually created it for a while. But what's interesting, and this is true of so many aspects of anarchism, is that there was actually a very, very similar program taking place in the United States 10 years before Proudhon comes up with it. And what we see in the United States, partly because, you know, it's a new country, people could move west and create whatever they wanted, we see a huge number of intentional experimental communities. And the guy who is most important from the anarchist point of view is Josiah Warren. Now, Warren was a musician. He's the inventor of the rotary press. He has 30, 40 patents, something like that. You know, a real genius. But he came up with a system that is very similar to Proudhon's system, and actually put it into practice in Cincinnati in the 1830s, the Cincinnati Time Store. It was he operated it for 2.5, 3 years. It was so successful that he closed it down and went around the country proselytizing. And the result was a number of intentional communities in the United States, like Harmony and Equity and Modern Times, and there were a wide variety of these kinds of communities. Another one, by the way, was Oneida. Many of you have probably heard of Oneida Silver. Well, that started as an anarchist community. A guy by the name of Noyes was the bigwig there. And the Oneida Silver still is produced. It's no longer an anarchist collective. But that was one of many such examples in the United States of these intentional communities based on horizontal social relations. And that's another key term that is a modern term that really comes out of the crisis in Argentina in 2001. But it is the principle of modern, today, anybody who's an anarchist would basically argue for horizontalism, which means no hierarchy. Anarchists are opposed to all forms of hierarchy, again, because it robs you of your agency. It robs you of your humanity. It robs you of your subjectivity, your ability to act. So these intentional communities didn't involve large numbers of people, but they were very successful. The one in Modern Times kind of failed because free love was one of the principles, and so it was close enough. It was on Long Island, and it was close enough for the tourists to come out and try their luck, and that kind of destroyed that system. But there were many of these kinds of movements. But it's not until the middle of the 19th century that anarchism begins to become a mass movement. And that's because economic relations are changing. In the time of Proudhon, in the time of Warren, individual entrepreneurs, small workplaces, 3, 4, 6 employees, 10 employees maybe was the model. And in France throughout the 19th century, small enterprises were the case. That's one reason why anarchism takes such deep roots in France. But as the Industrial Revolution takes place, and really picks up steam, for example, in the United States, look at statistics before the Civil War and after the Civil War. Look at how many miles of railroad there was, how many tons of steel produced, how much coal produced, and you will see an unbelievable transformation between 1860 and 1865. And in the United States afterwards, you begin to see labor strife. And what people forget, it was an incredibly violent time. And the violence was not coming from the anarchists, and it was not coming from the workers. It was coming from the capitalist class, who organized themselves in self-defense, forming, for example, the Pinkertons. They grew directly out of business associations, hiring thugs, basically, to police the factories and to prevent the workers from organizing their unions. Okay, so we get. I'll focus on the United States because most of us know more about that than Europe. But in the United States, industrial strife really starts to pick up middle of the 1870s, and by 1886, you're talking about in Chicago, for example. There were multiple anarchist newspapers in Czech, in German, in Polish, in Italian, in Spanish, in French, in multiple language, multiple newspapers. Before the Haymarket Massacre, the anarchists were able to put out 60,000 people on the streets of Chicago in demonstrations. This is a mass movement by this point. Okay. Now, many of the people who are leading the movement would not call themselves anarchists, but the principles that they are articulating are anarchists. But there are indeed very self-conscious anarchists, and among the 7 Haymarket martyrs who, how many people know about the Haymarket? Yeah, it's one of the better known events of anarchist history, but for those of you who have never heard of it, the Haymarket is a square. The Mccormick Reaper factory was on strike. It locked the workers out. McCormick had his thugs fire on the workers, killed a few workers. There's a protest movement called for the next day, and there's actually a bomb thrown at the end. The mayor's there. And he says, "Oh, this is peaceful. Go home. Don't worry about it," to the police. He leaves, and somebody throws a bomb. No one knows who threw it. Very well could have been an anarchist. Very well could have been someone hired by the local businessmen who at the time were hiring people to pose as anarchists. And you see this over and over and over again. You see it in Europe as well, particularly in the 90s. Many of the acts attributed to anarchists are actually agent provocateurs. People hired by businessmen to give the labor movement a bad name. So what happens in the Haymarket is that people are rounded up, including the people who were, some people who were on the stage, but some people who weren't even there. And there are 7 of them tried. Two of them are let off. 1 killed himself, and 5 are hung. 1 killed himself with a blasting cap smuggled in the day before he was supposed to be hung. Well, a few years later, the governor of Illinois apologized for what he called a judicial murder, because there was no evidence that these people were involved in any way, shape, or form. If you read the trial transcripts and so forth, they were tried because they were anarchists, and only because they were anarchists. It was an ideology that was put on trial. And this is the atmosphere that you get in the United States between the 1870s and the 1930s. Until the sit-down strikes and until labor comes up with a tactic that allows them to actually get organized. We're talking now about a very brutal, violent struggle. And the Homestead Battle, many are killed. I mean, it could go on and on and on about the different massacres that take place. But what's emerging at this time is that people like Albert Parsons, who was one of the Haymarket martyrs, he had become a full-fledged anarchist. If you read his work, it's no different from Bakunin or Kropotkin or anybody else. And his family goes all the way back to the Mayflower. Now, most of the people who were involved in the anarchist movement at this time were immigrants, and they brought their anarchism with them. So, for example, Johann Most. If you've seen, cartoons of the bearded guy throwing a bomb, it's usually based upon Johann Most. Now, Johann Most was a member of the German Parliament, gets kicked out of Parliament, comes to the United States, and he becomes the leading proponent of revolution through dynamite in the United States. And so many of the important people who get involved in American anarchism were immigrants that came and brought their anarchism with them. There's not a strong indigenous tradition of anarchism in the United States, but there is. And these are the Boston anarchists. And these are the people like Josiah Warren and Lysander Spooner. Spooner was cited, for example, by Scalia shortly before he died in one of the cases. Spooner was a strong opponent of slavery and so forth. And in fact, almost all of the radical abolitionists, they were anarchists. They didn't call themselves anarchists. They called themselves come-outers. And what did that mean? It means come out of your institutions. Come out of your marriage. Come out of your churches. Come out of your political parties. Come out of all these oppressive hierarchical organizations and rule yourself. And slavery, chattel slavery, was but one example of many forms of slavery. And so the radical abolitionists were certainly opposed to slavery, but they were opposed to all forms of domination. So there's another principle of anarchism: non-domination. We have to expunge the will to dominate others if we're to have an anarchist society. So opposition to the state, federation, opposition to capitalism, okay, the right of private judgment. These are basic principles, and of opposition, horizontalism, opposition to all forms of domination. Those are the fundamental principles of anarchism. Now, I mentioned a couple important people. Let me kind of give an outline of the various schools of anarchist thought, and then we'll have some time for questions. Okay, as I said, Godwin's was largely philosophical. Proudhon's was mutualist, and it was small scale. Okay, when Bakunin comes along, he's talking about forming an international organization of labor. He argues if capital crosses borders, labor can cross borders, and if capital is organized internationally, then labor should be organized internationally. And Bakunin, he gets involved with the International. The International is started when a group of French mutualists come to London, where London at the time was an open city, and there was just, there was repression going on all over the place, particularly after 1848, and that was a very revolutionary year, and the reaction set in, and between 50 and 80 you had some pretty repressive politics. Anyway, these mutualist workers come to London, they hook up with some guild socialists, and they decide that they're going to form the First International. And there's a young guy there at the time by the name of Karl Marx, who is asked, he's very unimportant, he is by no stretch of the imagination a significant figure at the time. He is asked to kind of write the statutes for the First International, and Marx becomes eventually one of the major figures in the First International. And the politics of the First International are defined by the struggle between Marx and Bakunin. So what is that struggle about? Marx, as I said, was an authoritarian. Okay? The fundamental difference between Marxists and anarchists is that Marxists want to capture the levers of power and rule in the name of workers. Anarchists want to destroy those levers of power. Okay? Marx wanted a political revolution. And Marx uses the term dictatorship of the proletariat 5 times in all of his work. In each instance, what that term means, dictatorship of the proletariat, is that because workers are a majority, if they were free to organize, and they were not, for example, in France it was illegal for more than 3 people to stand on a corner together, but if workers were free to organize, because they were a majority, they would win an election and, in the idiom of the day, dictate. That's what dictatorship of the proletariat means. It means a political revolution. It means a political party that captures power. Well, Marx realized, of course, that the capitalist class is not going to surrender power peacefully, and revolution might be necessary. But his preferred form of attaining power was political conquest, to take over the state. Okay? That's the fundamental difference, because the anarchists want to do away with the state. They want a social revolution. Anarchists want to transform social relations, get rid of hierarchy, create face-to-face, local, human kinds of social relations. Now, if we were to talk about what that would look like today, it might look like Mondragon in Spain. Anybody familiar with Mondragon? Couple. Okay. Mondragon is not anarchist. In fact, it was started by a Jesuit priest in 47 or 8, something like that. Started with a group of fishermen. They were out of work. I think there were less than a dozen of them. That is now a collection of enterprises in Spain, more than 100 major corporations, including the largest ship manufacturer, the largest producers of white goods, washing machines, refrigerators, and so forth. They have labor-intensive, capital-intensive, they have financial operations. You name it, they have it. Okay? And the way Mondragon works is that you buy your job. Okay? In other words, to get a job, you have to put up X amount of money. If you don't have that money, they will lend it to you. Okay? But that means you now own part of the company. You're a worker, you work there, but you're also an owner. So these are worker-owned and operated enterprises. Okay? The workers hire their bosses. They still have managers. You need somebody to make sure that you've got the widgets that you need when it's time to put everything together. So you have to have managers to organize stuff and so forth. But those managers are responsible to the workers. No one makes more than 3 times the lowest paid worker. Now in Argentina, in the the worker-owned and operated enterprises, the recuperated enterprises that are operated under this principle, it's equal wages. And I prefer that kind of a system. In Mondragon, they actually found that in order to attract some engineers and software people, they actually had to go beyond their 3-to-1 ratio. But by and large, they have maintained a 3-to-1 ratio. No one makes more than 3 times the lowest paid worker, which means there's much more equality and so forth. So in terms of economic relations, in a modern state, they would be face-to-face. One of the things that Mondragon discovered was that if the enterprises grow much beyond 1,000, conflict is more likely. In fact, one grew to about 7,000 and they actually had a strike. They struck against themselves. Okay, crazy. But what they learned from that is that in order for these systems to work, you really have to trust the people that you're working with. And when you go much beyond 1,000 people, you can't really know that many. And in fact, one of my teacher professors at graduate school wrote a book called Size and Democracy, and his conclusion was that it was impossible to have a face-to-face kind of real democracy, not a representative system, but a real where everybody is making the decision. You can't go beyond 10,000, and then that's getting problematic. So the idea is to keep things small, human. When these enterprises were so successful that they grew larger and larger and larger, they split off, and they create a new enterprise. And that's how they have grown to over 100 enterprises, tens of thousands of employees, incredibly successful. So on an economic front, that changes the whole relationship of capitalism. You know, they're both the capitalist because they're providing the funds, you know, for the enterprise by buying their job, and they're workers and capitalists simultaneously. So it erases the contradiction of capitalism. Okay, so the fundamental question between Marx and Bakunin was, how do you secure the interests of the workers? For Marx, it was to capture the state and rule in the name of the workers. For the anarchist, it was smash these massive hierarchical organizations and recreate small-scale communities based upon face-to-face equal relations in which decisions are taken collectively, and importantly, in an anarchist society, you have the right of secession. For example, if the community wants to build a bridge, you think it's a dumb idea, it's only going to bring outsiders into the community or whatever, you can refuse to give your portion of whatever was decided. Each member would contribute to the bridge, but you can't use the bridge. Okay? So, of course, things get complicated. That's not always going to work, but the idea is, as much as possible, you allow, you don't coerce people into conforming. You have to persuade, and that goes all the way back to Godwin. Godwin's very, very big on persuasion. Okay, so Marx and Bakunin start battling it out in the International, trying out these different ideas: political revolution versus social revolution. The International is growing. They're having conferences in Europe. You know, it's getting so threatening that the capitalist class is also organizing, and the heads of state is organizing against the International. And what happens is the Franco-Prussian War breaks out in 1871. There's supposed to be a conference in London. Most of the anarchists in France had been arrested, and that was where the movement was strongest. You could not travel at the time, so it was impossible for delegates from Belgium and France and Spain and Italy to get to London for the meeting. So it was kind of a rump congress, if you will. Marx takes advantage of the fact that his followers in London were still there, and all of Bakunin's followers were either in jail or stuck someplace in Europe, and they couldn't get to London. And Marx basically decides, he realizes that Bakunin is winning the battle, that the majority is firmly in the anarchist camp. He manipulates the body to move the headquarters of the International to that center of labor activity in New York City. No, it wasn't a center of labor activity at the time. He does this knowing full well that it will be the death of the International, but he would rather have the International die than have it taken over by Marx, by Bakunin. Now, at the time, Bakunin was advocating only collectivization of the means of production. That is, take over the factories, give them to the workers, let the workers decide. But significantly, he was not arguing for collectivization of consumption. In other words, communism. So Bakunin was an anarcho-collectivist. But the next generation that comes along are two very important geographers, Elisée Reclus, who in the second half of the 19th century is the world's greatest geographer. His Universal Geography is the 19 volumes. There's another set that's 21. Some of the most beautiful books ever produced. I mean, unbelievable woodcuts and maps, and basically Reclus invents social ecology. He argues that the land, nature, has a huge impact on how societies organize themselves, and that in fact nature is man is nature becoming conscious of itself. That's Reclus' motto. Man is nature becoming conscious of himself. And anyway, Reclus is in the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune takes place right after the Franco-Prussian War. France loses to Germany in the armistice. Basically Germany captured all the French soldiers in the armistice. It's agreed that the Germans are going to occupy Paris. The Parisians say, no way! And they rise up and organize a commune. The Paris Commune becomes the model of revolution for the next 100 years. Reclus was a member of the Commune. He's arrested. 20,000 people were massacred by the authorities. Many were exiled. He was supposed to be exiled, but because he was such a well-known scientist, many people, including Darwin, wrote to get him out of jail, and he was able. His sentence was changed from deportation to exile, which means he just had to leave France, go someplace else. Deportation would have meant he'd end up in Caledonia. So he ends up in Switzerland. And about the same time that he ends up in Switzerland, I'm collapsing things here, another incredibly important geographer from Russia shows up in Switzerland. And they become close friends and collaborators and end up spending a summer together in Clarens in Switzerland on the shores of Lake Geneva. And that is where Reclus transformed Peter Kropotkin, Prince Peter Kropotkin, page to the Tsar, into the most important proponent of anarcho-communism. Kropotkin, at the end of the 19th century, he dies in 1922, after coming back after the Russian Revolution. Kropotkin was by far the most important of the anarchists. He was very, very well known, member of the Royal Society, the first to accurately map the Ural Mountains and the Siberian Mountains. Very, very important figure. And Kropotkin creates this new school, and he gets these ideas really from Reclus and his experience in the Paris Commune, and develops anarcho-communism, where not only are the means of production collectivized, but so are the products. So that if you need corn, you walk into the store and get it. Now, the culture that goes behind that has to be in place in order for that to work. And so another important component of anarchism is culture building. We have to be culture builders. We have to form a different culture with a different sense of responsibility, a different moral orientation. But nevertheless, for Kropotkin, the idea is that the bounty of nature belongs to everyone, and those that can produce, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So that communist principle that everybody associates with Marx, but was actually Wheatling, that principle is now part of the dominant school of anarchist thought, which is anarcho-communism. And now there are other schools. Shortly after this period, I'll do this quickly to wrap it up, syndicalism emerges. And syndicalism, a syndicate is just a union. That's the European term for a union. So syndicalism, anarcho-syndicalism, is basically arguing that the locus of authority should be the union. That unions should substitute for the state. So you get rid of the state, and then the economy and the community and everything is organized by the syndicates. Okay, and that becomes a very important strain, particularly in France. And in the United States, it becomes one of the most, one of the great unions of American history. Any fellow workers? The IWW. Are you? All right. Okay. The IWW was created in 1905. I mentioned Albert Parsons, his wife Lucy, a former slave. She was one of the founding members of the IWW. You would recognize probably some of the names. Anyway, the IWW's theme was fire your boss. Okay? Fire your boss. Okay? One big union. The idea, one of the reasons the capitalist class has maintained its power is it's divided labor. So that in one particular enterprise, you might have 6, 7, 8 different unions. One union goes on strike, you depend on the solidarity of the others, and it's not always there. The IWW argued one big union, and we bring down the capitalist system by organizing all workers into one union, then calling a general strike and bringing the system to a crashing fall. And the IWW was incredibly successful, scared the hell out of the authorities. There was a general strike in Seattle in 19. It was very, very important. But what happens, of course, is what happens in 1919 to 21? Well, the Russian Revolution and the response of the United States is what? The Red Scare, exactly. That's really when the anarchist movement dies in the United States, because it's decapitated. Emma Goldman, the most important anarchist at the time in the United States, she's put on a boat and shipped off to Russia, stripped of her American citizenship. Okay, illegally stripped of her American citizenship. Okay? So, after the Russian Revolution, communism becomes the dominant position among the left and labor, and anarchism subsides, largely because it's been suppressed. The major leaders have been jailed, killed. For example, Flores Magón. Is that a name anybody knows from the Mexican Revolution? He was one of the most important leaders of the Mexican Revolution, but he led it from L.A. He wrote, he had a great journal, but he ends up dying in Leavenworth in 24. Okay, so over and over and over again, the leaders of labor are killed, jailed, deported, and that's one of the reasons anarchism dies in the United States. Communism begins to grow in force in the 20s and 30s. There's an interregnum in which there's not a lot of anarchist activity anywhere, okay? But there's little specks here and there. For example, City Light Books. You know City Light Books in San Francisco? Peter Martin, that's his store. His father's Carlo Tresca. Carlo Tresca is the most important Italian anarchist in the United States in the first third of the 20th century. The question, who killed Carlo Tresca, is important because with the death of Carlo Tresca, that in essence is the death of anarchism in the United States. Now, Tresca, he was part of the Silk Strike in Paterson. He was a major organizer. He was part of the Defense Committee for Sacco and Vanzetti, two other anarchists who were falsely accused and is definitively demonstrated they did not fire the gun that for which they were electrocuted. Anyway, Tresca is very, very much involved with the movement at the time, and his son, Peter Martin, with Ginsberg and some of the others, keep anarchism alive through things like City Light Books, and a number of people like Paul Goodman. How many have read Growing Up Absurd? No? Even people my age haven't read it? Okay. Paul Goodman, an anarchist, and Growing Up Absurd was on basically every shelf when I was in college. These are the people that kind of kept the flame going, but it was a cultural flame, and this is the important point that I'll make here, is that anarchism, after the Red Scare, anarchism isn't so much a political movement anymore as it is a cultural movement. And the Impressionists are very important in this, particularly the Neo-Impressionists. Every single Neo-Impressionist was an anarchist. Pissarro financed the anarchist press. His painting is the anarchist utopia. Go look at Pissarro's pictures of the countryside and look at it with a new eye, because what he's showing you is not the onerous work of working for someone else, but the joyful work of working for yourself and living in nature in a harmonious way. So anarchism becomes kind of a cultural movement and has a big impact in the 60s. Many of us didn't know it, For example, when I was at Berkeley in the 60s, I thought I was a Marxist. I thought I was a Marxist who had problems with the dictatorship of the proletariat, who had a problem with the vanguard, who had a problem with the role of peasants in a revolution. Marx said, what are peasants? They're just like potatoes. So the only thing that unites them is their sack, is their condition. Okay? On and on and on. And somebody says to me, you're not a Marxist, you're an anarchist. And I'm not an anarchist, I don't throw bombs, I'm non-violent, I'm a pacifist. What do you mean? What do you mean I'm an anarchist? No, go read it. So I did. I began to read Murray Bookchin. Now, Murray Bookchin is a very nearing kind of character. He started a center in Vermont that has produced a lot of anarchists and so forth, a back to the land kind of movement, and he brings a lot of do-it-yourself into the anarchist culture, which is very much a part of culture today. The anarchist culture today is very much about self-sufficiency and do-it-yourself, which of course has a lot to do with nearing. Okay, in the modern movement, its most important manifestation was probably Occupy, and I hope you know that was an anarchist-inspired and organized event. The call to Occupy came from Adbusters. Adbusters is a culture jamming group. Culture jamming is a kind of way of organizing now. So, for example, my favorite culture jammers today are the Yes Men. They impersonate corporate executives, WTO types, and so forth. And one time they impersonated a Union Carbine executive, and they got on the BBC and announced that Union Carbine had taken over the company that had, I forget what it was now, that the Bhopal, you remember Bhopal, that killed tens of thousands of people in India? And they never compensated the people for it. Well, the Yes Men went on BBC pretending to be these Union Carbine executives, and they said, we are now going to take responsibility. We've taken over the company. We're going to take responsibility, and we're going to give compensation. Billions dropped of their stock that day before they found out that these guys were not who they said they were. So culture jamming, using political jujitsu like that is very much part of it. Anyway, Adbusters were the people, and they do similar kinds of thing with ads. They'll switch an ad and make it the message the opposite of what they intended, what the advertiser intended. Anyway, they made the call for Occupy, and they caught the ear of David Graeber. David Graeber, if you want to read the best writer today in anarchism, it's David Graeber. He wrote a book called Debt that's fabulous, a whole lot of other important works. But anyway, he went to the Adbusters and came up with the whole idea of assemblies and the decision making and the whole way that Occupy was organized. So the politics of Occupy were very much anarchist politics, and people argue, well, it failed. Nonsense. Bernie Sanders never would have happened without Occupy. The conversation changed, and that was the point. Call attention. Get people talking. See things in a different way. The idea of the 1%, what a great meme. And it really, well, it's not such a great meme because it really should be the 0.001%. But it focuses on the fundamental problem of our economy today, of our society today, and that is the fundamental inequality that hasn't been seen since the Gilded Era, and may even be worse. So anyway, anarchism has a long tradition, a varied tradition. There are different schools of thought. I haven't even gone into pink, green, black, and white anarchism, different blocks, so forth. But what unites all anarchists, regardless of their emphasis, is the right of private judgment. The idea that you have to decide for yourself how to relate to other people and what you're going to do with your life, and you can't allow other people to rule you. So opposition to the state, opposition to capitalism, horizontalism, federation, systems of government, face-to-face consensus decision-making, these are the fundamentals of anarchism, and what makes us very different from Marxists. Thanks. So, I'm happy to answer questions or listen to comments.
I think if you ask now who the anarchists are in the group,
You might get a different answer, huh?
yeah, because I didn't realize that in my heart I'm one.
Well, I always say every American is an anarchist without knowing it.
Yeah.
If you go back and I'm a genealogy junkie. You name someone in Virginia history, they're my relative. So Jefferson's my third cousin, and so forth and so on. But two of the big battles that were going on leading up to the revolution had to do with this question of the right of private judgment. And it's as the dissenters grow in the United States that you begin to see much more support for getting rid of their rulers in England. You know, as long as they're still identified with the Church of England, you know, as long as, you know, you begin to see the Baptists kind of challenge in the 30s, and you see, the Presbyterians, then you see the Baptists in the 40s, and then the Methodists in the 60s. And all of them are, you know, polishing this idea of the right of private judgment. And the same arguments that apply to why priests, popes, and bishops should not be interfering with your relationship to God is the same argument for why congressmen, senators, and presidents shouldn't be interfering with how you choose to live your life.
How does that play out in schools and in families with regard to authority figures and young people?
Yeah, excellent, excellent. There's a very, very long tradition of anarchist education. My class is part of that tradition. I don't grade in my class. The students grade themselves. But probably the most, I started with Godwin. Godwin designed a school. He created his own school. No one showed up, but he designed it anyway. For example, in the United States, let me go to the source. Francisco Ferrer. He's hung in 1905 in Spain. Why? Because he argued for secular education. At the time, of course, in Spain, everybody was Catholic. You know, everybody had to go to Catholic school. He argued for secular education, and he created what is known as the modern school. And if you all, I'm sure everybody knows something about Montessori. Well, it's kind of along Montessori principles, where you don't force the child to read. When the child's ready to read, you help the child learn to read. You don't force them at, age 7, you have to be reading X level. Okay? So, a number of schools were created in the United States. The most important and interesting one in the United States was in Stelton, New Jersey. Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, the famous Russian immigrant American anarchists, were involved in the establishment of Stelton. The Durants, Will and Ariel Durant, those multi-volume histories of the world, they were teachers there. The playwright O'Neill taught there. There were all kinds of very, very important people, but you were the child's helper, not the teacher. So if they expressed an interest in art, you provided the materials. You showed them other art, that kind of thing, where you don't have a fixed curriculum where everybody has to march along to that curriculum. So Anarchist Education, Paul Goodman, Growing Up Absurd, he was a preeminent example of an educator, an anarchist educator who wanted to see things change. Now, children can't be allowed to do anything if you want them to survive. Children don't have the capacity to reason until, at least for most, around age 13. Anarchism requires reason. It requires persuasion, discussion, back and forth. So for children, you don't apply the principles the same way as you would an adult. Very young children need structure, But the older they get, the less structure, the more you allow them to work things out for themselves. But everyone recognizes that this is something. Anarchism requires maturity. What you do in terms of raising children is that you model equal relationships. You model taking responsibility around the house, for example. You show children how they should behave, but you don't enforce it. You don't jam it down their throats. But you have to recognize that until the age of reason, you have to treat children a little bit differently than you would treating someone capable of reason. It's a question of responsibility. Anarchists are fundamentally responsible, and that's why we don't hold crazy people and children responsible for crimes, is they don't have the capacity to reason, to see the consequences of their events and so forth, their actions. So there's got to be a little bit of balancing for the youngest children, and you got to make it open, but more structure for very young children than you would have for, say, 9, 10, and beyond. Yeah.
I'm trying to...
No, in back.
Do you see any remnants of the movement that you see as having led to Bernie Sanders that might cultivate more political movements?
Yeah, I don't. The point I made about Bernie Sanders was essentially that he changed the conversation. Not that Bernie's politics are great.
But Occupy had something to do with it.
Yeah, Occupy changed the conversation. No one was talking about inequality before Occupy. After Occupy, that's what everybody was talking about. Okay, that was my main point there. But in terms of remnants, there is a very, very active anarchist culture. If you go to Europe, for example, you could spend months in Europe and never touch money and eat and be housed and do whatever you want and be entertained every night. There's a squatting. These are squats. A big part of the modern anarchist movement is taking over abandoned buildings and putting them back to bringing them back into use. And so you can go to Amsterdam or any major city in Europe, and you will find anarchists who have taken over buildings, and you can become a part of that community, and no money is exchanged. Food is everybody does their part to do whatever needs to be done to maintain the place, but it's wide open, no money. So there is, for example, in Greece, I'm sure you've heard about the community. There's a whole community that's controlled by the anarchists around the university. The police don't even go there. And there are places, for example, Christiania. Has anybody been to Christiania in Copenhagen? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's amazing. It's a community that was built on an old Navy base that was squatted. And now a couple thousand people live there, several thousand people. They've limited the size and growth and so forth. But if you go there, there's not one building the same. I mean, it is really remarkable. Crazy architecture, wide open and so forth. The city is trying to clamp down, and there's been struggles back and forth. But Christiania is a very good example of an anarchist community today, still in operation.
Berlin too is coming up to do something.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, and there's one in Paris right now that the police are attacking because it was an old. It was supposed to be a third airport or fourth airport outside Paris, about an hour outside, and they never built it. And so the anarchists took it over for the last 15 years or so, and now they're bulldozing them out of there.
Want it back. The establishment want it back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything relevant to
The primitivists. There is a strain of anarchism known as primitivism, and they would argue that that's what you should do, and get rid of about 8 out of every 9 people on Earth, and then things would work. But no, what I would argue, well, a couple things is I'm a philosophical anarchist, but I'm a practical Democrat. In other words, I will do what I can to move in the right direction, but and that's a small d Democrat, by the way. But you have to start where you are. And if we woke up tomorrow and it was an anarchist society, it would be a disaster. We don't have the culture for it. We haven't built that culture of solidarity. It requires mutual aid. Mutual aid is another principle I didn't even know. Kropotkin wrote a wonderful book called Mutual Aid. And that book is his response to social Darwinism. Basically, the social Darwinists were saying that the society that we have is a society that is just. That the people on top are there because they deserve to be. They're the fittest. Okay? So survival of the fittest meant individuals struggled against other individuals and rose to the top. Kropotkin said, wait a minute, that's not what Darwin was talking about. He doesn't talk about competition between individuals. He talks about competition between species. And Kropotkin's point, through almost 400 pages, is example after example, from insect world to medieval towns to modern guilds and so forth, demonstrating that it is the species that cooperate most who are best fit for the struggle of survival. So cooperation, not competition. Cooperation within the species is the key to success. And the species that cooperate most are best suited for the struggle for survival.
That the people who are the theorists for the Gaia hypothesis agree with that.
Yeah.
Partnering and community, working together,
Right.
cooperation is the most adaptive strategy.
Right. Yeah, and Stephen Jay Gould, I don't know if people are familiar with Stephen Jay Gould, but he was the great evolutionary psychologist at Harvard, evolutionary theorist at Harvard, most popular professor at Harvard. Thousands of people wanted to get into his classes. But he wrote an article titled "Kropotkin Was Right." That is cooperation. That's the key. Yeah.
So, I want to push the every American is an anarchist thing, because I think if you understand Americanness as also evolving out of mechanisms of capture, so like summer colonialism, the history of capitalism also being a racial capitalism, how do we deal with Americanism being anarchistic while also being like a method of capture as it began?
Yeah. When I say every American is an anarchist, what I mean is that there's in American culture there's that strain of rebellion, that frontiersman kind of attitude, and a lot of people argue that Shays' Rebellion was kind of a model of a precursor. Not Shays' Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion was a precursor to the American Revolution. It wasn't any such thing at all. Bacon wanted to kill Indians. That's what it was about, because he wanted the market. So we've been driven by those forces, but there's always this countervailing force of liberty. And even in the religious traditions among the dissenters, that's what they were talking about. They were talking freedom of conscience, liberty, and that libertarian strain in American culture is what I'm talking about. But of course, it was founded on slavery. It was founded on capitalism. It was founded on stealing land. But that doesn't change the fact that those who engaged in those activities thought of themselves as expanding freedom, expanding markets.
So then, if you think about homesteaders in that, you're in a really complicated place, right?
Oh yeah.
Because this theoretic of going back to the land isn't
whose land?
Your land to go back to. So then what you're doing is that your anarchism. How are you then talking about land rights
Yeah. Well, you have to live in the time that you live, and we have to live conscious of the past, but there's nothing that we can do about that past. The past is the past, and we can only do our best not to repeat those mistakes and to honor those whose lives make our life today possible.
Yeah, so one thing that occurs to me is that the point you made about scale is a real problem.
It is a real
If you
problem.
Scale it, well then what? So that's just one thing over
Yeah,
there.
yeah, you've got to completely reorganize.
Yeah. So the second thing that occurred to me was when you talk about sort of the historical sweep of what people were capable of doing, how they then could communicate, how they then could come together, and certain ideas were in competition, and those ideas were articulated by different people with different capacities to articulate those ideas and so on. And now sort of roll the ball forward and to take the Bernie Sanders example, I think it's interesting that in the political dialogue, I don't know what other people would say, but my sense was, yeah, in the United States as it exists today, the best way to defeat somebody is tag them a socialist, and that's the end of that.
Yeah.
It's a dirty word. So you have socialists, you have communists, you have capitalists, you have anarchists, etc. And there are a bunch of things in competition. And one of the things that I just encountered really recently I thought was very interesting is that really the concept and the discussion and the understanding of distributive economics has kind of gone away somehow out of the academic dialogue.
Yeah.
And so we can't even really talk about, yes, inequity and therefore now what. But if you say you have to live in the historical time you're in, so let's just say the historical time we're in is now manifesting the greatest inequity or inequitability, or whatever that word would be, right, in human history.
Yeah.
The engine for creating it is working extremely well. Okay, this is the longest introduction to the question you've had so far. So now, what would you say about the potential for, I don't know what you would call it, intellectual, cultural, political revolution around some new version of these ideas in the struggle towards equity, that has to be articulated by somebody, but now it can be propagated more efficiently and broadly than ever in human history. So a meme can penetrate, everything. So what's your comment on? No, real transformation is possible, even though it seems like the economic debate has been captured completely by the capitalists who understand how to concentrate capital and how to use concentrated capital to concentrate capital further. So, a very smart, articulate, young woman with some ideas is going to have trouble getting them out there because, hey, the power is totally against you, and so please comment.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's become clear to me over the last few years in teaching my course as I go through it is that each one of these schools that I've kind of identified is an anarchism for their time. Mutualism was appropriate to Proudhon's time. It's not appropriate necessarily today. That approach is not going to work. Likewise, mass revolutionary activity was appropriate to the time of the Haymarket and the incredibly violent capitalist class becoming conscious of itself. Because the capitalist class was becoming conscious of itself just as the workers were becoming conscious of itself. So the point I would say is that today, anarchism in 20 years is going to look a lot different than anything that we have today. It will probably be very much rooted in the internet and distributed forms of communication, because even though the powers that be have more resources than ever to get their message across, so do we. If you look at the Arab Spring, that was possible largely because of the ability of the protesters to communicate among themselves through social media. So I'm not sure exactly how that's going to, I never would have predicted culture jamming as an anarchist form, but there will be something along the lines of using the internet to coordinate, to spread ideas. But again, I don't know. I'm not much of a prognosticator.
With the Occupy movement, I know a big part of it was that they were sitting in at banks. They were trying to get people to realize that we have to take our money away from the people who are enslaving us,
Yeah.
basically. So,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that seems like the most effective strategy because we all have dollars to spend, and if you're funding
Yeah.
the people who are,
Yeah.
controlling
Yeah, I'm for all of that stuff. I mean, every form of resistance possible. There's not going to be one key. It's going to be wearing them down. We've got to be the glue, as they used to say. We've got to be the glue in the locks.
It just seemed like that movement just died, though. It was like getting a lot of attention. They were
Well-
sitting out banks. They were,
It died, but they went off and they did other things. Now they're doing something else. Now they're organizing all kinds of different activities. It goes on and on. And there's not ever going to be, I think a lot of people wanted Occupy to have a program and to go out there and win an election. That wasn't the point. It was consciousness raising. That's what they were trying to do. Change people's ideas. And, that's where the battle has to take place, is in the realm of ideas to get people to see things in a different way.
One last question.
So,
Well, I don't think it changes. Anarchists, in if you go back to the 19th century, you look at same-sex love, the only place you're going to find it is among the Marxists. I mean, that was terrible. The point is, how do I want to we're never going to have a perfect solution. There will always be prejudiced people. There will always be bigots and so forth. We have to become resilient enough that we... Pass the question because I'm Well, yeah, I guess what I was confused about is that we've always challenged. We've always challenged those powers. And we will continue to challenge. any kind of impingement upon your rights of judgment, any restriction on you. Here's a way of, I think, thinking about it. You've probably heard this before, but I'm free to swing my arms as much as I want. I'm still free. I'm still free. I'm still free. Whoop, not free anymore. Okay, so the point is you don't infringe upon other people. And that's part of what we have to develop a culture, is a respect for other people's rights, recognizing that those are your rights too. That you have the same rights as the other person, and you have to respect them in their point of view. If it's a point of view that is causing harm, then you need to confront it.
We had a presenter last year from South Africa who talked about a concept called Ubuntu, U-B-O-N-T-U. Look that up, because that's exactly what Dan is talking about. Respecting each other's individuality to the nth degree. And that as a guiding principle for all of us to live by. Look that up, and you'll be impressed with it, I think. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.